The hum of the airplane engine filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, some scrolling through their phones, while others stowed their luggage in the overhead compartments. Among them was Marcus, a sharply dressed man in his early 30s, carrying an air of quiet confidence. He'd spent years building his career as a software engineer and was finally heading to a conference where he'd present a project he had poured his heart into. This flight was supposed to be the first step toward a defining moment in his life. Little did he know, it would become unforgettable for an entirely different reason. As Marcus moved down the aisle to his assigned seat, he caught a few polite smiles and exchanged a nod or two with fellow passengers. But then came the moment that would set everything into motion. Just as he reached his row, a voice broke through the din of activity, a sharp, authoritative tone that instantly commanded attention. "Excuse me, sir," said a flight attendant, her crisp uniform immaculate, but her expression anything but welcoming. Her name tag read Karen. With her arms crossed and eyes narrowed, she gestured toward Marcus, as if he had just broken some unspoken rule. "I think you're in the wrong section." Marcus blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," he replied politely, holding up his boarding pass to show her. He wasn't looking for trouble, but the tension in her voice made his stomach tighten. Karen barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "No, sir. This section is for premium class passengers. Economy is toward the back." Her tone carried an edge of disbelief, as if someone like him couldn't possibly belong there. Marcus's brow furrowed, and he remained calm. "This is a premium class ticket. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." By now, a few nearby passengers had begun to notice the interaction, their eyes darting between Marcus and Karen like spectators at a tennis match. Some wore expressions of mild curiosity, while others looked uncomfortable, sensing the undercurrent of something more significant than a simple seating mix-up. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line as she took the boarding pass from Marcus's hand, scrutinizing it as though searching for a reason to prove him wrong. Her hesitation was telling. When she found nothing amiss, she handed it back with a curt nod but added, "Just make sure you stay in your seat. We had a lot of passengers who actually paid for these seats." The insinuation hung in the air, and Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but decided against it. This wasn't the hill he wanted to die on, not yet anyway. He took his seat by the window, hoping the awkward moment would pass. But it didn't. Throughout the pre-flight preparations, Karen's eyes seemed to find Marcus again and again. She hovered in his row, offering over-the-top smiles and assistance to passengers on either side of him, while conveniently ignoring him entirely. When drink orders were taken, Marcus' request for a glass of water was met with a dismissive, "We'll get to you later." 30 minutes into the flight, later still hadn't come. By this point, Marcus wasn't the only one who had noticed. The woman seated next to him, an elderly traveler with a kind smile, leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her get to you. Some people just carry their prejudice around like luggage they can't let go of." Her words were both a comfort and a confirmation of what Marcus had been suspecting all along. This wasn't just about a seat or a drink. It was about something deeper, uglier, something Marcus had encountered before, but never expected to face in a supposedly professional environment like this. As the flight progressed, Karen's behavior grew more blatant. She made a point of fussing over other passengers while avoiding Marcus entirely. At one point, she even went so far as to loudly suggest that some passengers should double-check their tickets before boarding, while standing just a few feet away from him. The implication was clear, and it stung. Marcus clenched his fists under the tray table, determined not to cause a scene. But when Karen returned with yet another pointed comment about knowing one's place, he realized staying silent wasn't an option anymore. He had two choices: let her behavior slide or stand up for himself in a way she'd never forget. Taking a deep breath, Marcus turned to face her, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, but is there a problem? Because if there is, I'd appreciate it if you addressed it directly with me." Karen blinked, clearly taken aback by his assertiveness. For a moment, the veneer of professionalism slipped, and the hostility in her eyes became unmistakable. But before she could respond, a voice from behind them cut through the tension like a knife. "Is there an issue here?" It was the lead flight attendant, a man with a calm demeanor and a sharp eye for conflict. He had been observing the interaction from a distance, and now, it seemed, he had seen enough to step in. Karen quickly composed herself, plastering on a tight smile. "Oh, no issue at all. Just making sure all our passengers are comfortable." Marcus didn't miss the flicker of annoyance in her expression as she walked away, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. It seemed the moment had passed, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. What happened next would not only change the course of the flight, but also leave everyone on board questioning their assumptions. As Marcus leaned back in his seat, he had no idea that the next 10 minutes would bring a twist no one saw coming. A moment of reckoning that would flip the narrative entirely. Marcus sat back in his seat, his heart pounding against his chest. He wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but something about the way Karen had treated him struck a nerve. He had experienced subtle forms of prejudice before, snide remarks, dismissive glances, but this was different. It was deliberate, calculated, and public. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds roll by, but his thoughts were far from the serene view outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that the incident wasn't isolated. It wasn't just about him or even this flight. It was a reflection of something larger, a symptom of a deeper issue that he'd encountered time and again. As he sat there, replaying the events in his mind, his neighbor leaned over again, a soft voice breaking the silence. "People like her don't change," the elderly woman said, her tone tinged with regret. "But that doesn't mean you have to let her win." Marcus turned to her, surprised by her insight. "I just don't understand why she's targeting me. I've done nothing wrong." The woman smiled sadly, her weathered hands resting on her lap. "Sometimes you don't have to do anything wrong. Some people see what they want to see, and that's enough for them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating her support, even if it didn't offer a solution. He didn't know what his next move would be, but he wasn't about to let Karen's behavior slide without consequence. A few rows back, a man in a business suit had been watching the interaction unfold. He was in his late 40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. His name was Peter, and though he hadn't planned to get involved, he couldn't ignore what he witnessed. As a frequent flyer and someone who valued fairness, Peter had little patience for unjust treatment. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation, just in case things escalated. Meanwhile, Karen had retreated to the galley, her frustration evident in the way she banged utensils and muttered under her breath. She felt her authority had been challenged, and that didn't sit well with her. She prided herself on maintaining control, and Marcus's calm defiance had unsettled her. It wasn't about the seat or the ticket. It was about maintaining the narrative she had created in her mind. The lead flight attendant, who had intervened earlier, approached her, his tone measured but firm. "Karen, is everything all right? You seem tense back there." She forced a smile, brushing off his concern. "Everything's fine. Just a bit of turbulence in the cabin." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He had worked with Karen long enough to recognize when she was being evasive. Still, he decided to monitor the situation, knowing that a single complaint from a passenger could spiral into a bigger issue if not handled properly. Back in his seat, Marcus tried to distract himself by scrolling through his tablet. He had a presentation to refine and emails to review, but his focus kept drifting back to Karen's words and actions. It wasn't just the blatant nature of her behavior. It was the way she had tried to undermine him in front of others, as if she were testing how far she could push without crossing an invisible line. The flight continued, and Marcus noticed that Karen's presence became less frequent. Perhaps she had decided to back off, or maybe she was plotting her next move. Either way, he remained on edge, his guard up for whatever might come next. As he contemplated his options, a soft chime signaled the start of the in-flight service. Karen emerged from the galley, her expression neutral, but her movements brisk. She began serving drinks and snacks to the passengers, her interactions polite but clipped. When she reached Marcus' row, she hesitated for a moment before handing him a cup of water without a word. The tension was palpable, but Marcus decided not to engage. He took the water with a quiet thank you, keeping his gaze steady. He knew he was walking a fine line, standing up for himself without giving Karen any ammunition to twist the narrative in her favor. A few rows ahead, a young couple exchanged glances, clearly aware of the undercurrent of hostility. They whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief. It was clear that Marcus wasn't the only one who had noticed Karen's behavior. As the flight progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Passengers who had been indifferent at first were now paying closer attention, their curiosity piqued by the subtle but undeniable tension between Marcus and Karen. The situation had become a silent spectacle, and Marcus could feel the weight of their stares. Karen, for her part, was becoming increasingly agitated. She could sense that the passengers were beginning to side with Marcus, even if they weren't saying it out loud. Her attempts to assert control were backfiring, and the realization only fueled her frustration. Then came the moment that changed everything. About 10 minutes later, as Karen was making her rounds, a commotion erupted near the back of the plane. A passenger had accidentally spilled a drink, and the liquid had spread across the aisle, creating a minor inconvenience. Karen rushed to the scene, eager to reassert her authority and deflect attention from her earlier behavior. But as she bent down to clean up the mess, she failed to notice Peter standing nearby, his phone in hand. He had been quietly documenting the situation, capturing Karen's interactions with Marcus and other passengers. He wasn't looking for drama, but he believed in accountability, and he had seen enough to know that Karen's actions needed to be addressed. As Karen straightened up, she caught sight of Peter's phone and immediately bristled. "Sir, is there a reason you're recording me?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Peter met her gaze calmly. "I'm documenting what's happening. As a frequent flyer, I think it's important to ensure that all passengers are treated fairly." Karen's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the lead flight attendant appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone firm. Peter turned to him, his expression serious. "I've been observing some concerning behavior from one of your crew members. I think it's something that needs to be addressed." The lead flight attendant frowned, his gaze shifting between Peter and Karen. "We'll handle this matter internally," he said, his tone measured but resolute. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the lead flight attendant held up a hand, silencing her. "Karen, I think it's best if you take a moment to step away. I'll take over from here." As Karen retreated to the galley, her expression a mix of anger and humiliation, Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of vindication. He hadn't planned for things to escalate this way, but he was grateful that someone had stepped in to hold Karen accountable. Still, the incident was far from resolved. The tension lingered in the air, and Marcus knew that the flight's landing would only mark the beginning of a larger confrontation, one that would force everyone involved to face the truth of what had transpired. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin was far from normal. Passengers who had been engrossed in their books, movies, or conversations were now quietly exchanging glances and whispers, piecing together the unfolding drama. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and sympathy. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to make of the growing attention. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but it seemed unavoidable now. In the galley, Karen paced back and forth, her frustration boiling over. She replayed the encounter with Peter in her mind, her indignation growing with each step. How dare he record her? And worse, how dare the lead flight attendant suggest she step away, as if she were the one at fault? Her sense of control was slipping, and she didn't know how to regain it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was spiraling out of her hands, and she resented Marcus for being at the center of it all. Meanwhile, Peter had returned to his seat, his phone securely tucked away. He wasn't one to seek conflict, but he also wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in. As a seasoned professional in corporate ethics, Peter had seen too many instances of people abusing their power. He recognized the subtle dynamics at play and felt compelled to act. He had no idea how the situation would unfold, but he was determined to ensure that justice, in whatever form it took, would prevail. As the lead flight attendant resumed his duties, he couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. He had worked with Karen for years and had always considered her competent, if a bit headstrong. But today she was different, tense, reactive, and frankly, unprofessional. He glanced toward Marcus's row, noting the man's composed demeanor despite the obvious tension he'd endured. The lead attendant knew he would need to address the situation formally once the flight landed, but for now, he focused on keeping the peace. Marcus tried to distract himself by focusing on his presentation, but his thoughts kept wandering. He was used to navigating difficult situations, but this felt personal in a way that was hard to ignore. His mind drifted to the people in his life who had shaped his resilience, his mother, who always told him to stand tall in the face of adversity, and his mentor, who had taught him the value of patience and strategic thinking. Their voices echoed in his mind, reminding him that how he responded now could set the tone for what happened next. The elderly woman beside him broke the silence again, her tone gentle but firm. "You've handled this well so far," she said. "But don't let them push you down. Speak up when the time is right." Her words resonated with Marcus. He nodded, offering a small smile of gratitude. He didn't know what the right time would look like, but he resolved to trust his instincts. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, define his worth. As the flight wore on, a new layer of tension emerged. A few passengers who had witnessed Karen's behavior began murmuring among themselves, their discontent growing louder. A young woman a few rows back, who had been silently observing the events, finally spoke up to a flight attendant passing by. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "I think there's something you should know about how one of your staff members has been treating a passenger. It's really unsettling." The attendant paused, taken aback. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll pass this along," he said, his tone professional but wary. Word spread quickly. Soon, other passengers began sharing their observations, each account painting a clearer picture of Karen's conduct. The lead flight attendant found himself fielding multiple comments, his concern deepening with every conversation. He realized this wasn't just a matter of internal protocol. It was a situation that could escalate into a public relations nightmare if not handled carefully. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were informed of the brewing conflict. While their primary focus remained on the safety and operation of the flight, they couldn't ignore the potential for the situation to spiral. The pilot, a seasoned professional with decades of experience, instructed the crew to document everything and prepare a report for the airline's management team upon landing. Back in the cabin, the tension reached a tipping point when Karen returned to the aisle. Her expression was a mix of defiance and unease, as if she were bracing herself for more scrutiny. As she passed by Marcus Rowe, she avoided eye contact, her lips pressed into a thin line. But her silence only added fuel to the fire. Passengers who had been hesitant to speak up earlier now felt emboldened, their voices grown louder. "Is she seriously just going to act like nothing happened?" someone muttered. "This isn't right," another passenger added. "He deserves an apology." Karen's steps faltered, and she turned sharply toward the murmuring voices. "If anyone has a complaint, they can address it with the airline after we land," she snapped, her voice tight with irritation. "I'm here to ensure a safe and comfortable flight, not to be subjected to baseless accusations." The response only deepened the divide. Marcus remained silent, his resolve firm. He didn't want to be dragged into a shouting match, especially not in a confined space like this. He knew that patience was his greatest ally, and he was determined to see this through with dignity. The elderly woman beside him patted his arm reassuringly. "Stay calm," she whispered. "They're watching, and they know the truth." As the plane began its descent, the mood in the cabin grew heavier. Passengers who had initially dismissed the drama as a minor inconvenience now realized they were witnessing something much bigger, a clash of values, power, and accountability. Marcus stared out the window, the sprawling city below growing closer with every passing second. He didn't know what awaited him on the ground, but he was ready to face it head-on. The final moments of the flight were tense and quiet, each passenger lost in their own thoughts. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. The cabin grew eerily quiet as the plane came to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. It was as if the tension hanging in the air had glued everyone to their seats, waiting for the next moment to unfold. Marcus remained seated, his hands resting on his lap, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Around him, passengers exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the tension that had built up over the course of the flight. Karen emerged from the galley, her face unreadable, but her posture rigid. She avoided looking at Marcus, but her movements were sharp, almost mechanical, as she prepared for the passengers to disembark. The lead flight attendant stood near the front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the rows, clearly anticipating further developments. There was a sense of something unspoken hanging in the air, a collective understanding that this wasn't just another routine landing. As the doors opened and passengers began filing out, Marcus stayed in his seat. He had no intention of rushing off the plane. He wanted to be deliberate, measured. The elderly woman beside him gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Don't let them push you aside." Marcus nodded, grateful for her support. He watched as Peter, the man who had recorded Karen's behavior, paused near the exit to speak with the lead flight attendant. Though Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, Peter's gestures and serious expression made it clear that he was advocating for action. The lead attendant nodded, his face tight with concern, before signaling to another crew member. Karen, who had been pretending to organize the seat pockets, stiffened as she noticed the exchange. Her eyes darted toward Marcus for a brief second before she turned away, her hands trembling slightly. She knew that something was coming, but she wasn't ready to face it. Her mind raced, searching for ways to deflect responsibility, to control the narrative before it spiraled out of her grasp entirely. When the last of the passengers had disembarked, the lead flight attendant approached Marcus' row. "Sir," he began, his tone calm but serious, "if you don't mind, I'd like to have a word with you before you leave the aircraft. We're committed to addressing any concerns you may have." Marcus looked up, his expression steady. "I appreciate that," he replied. "I think it's important that we have this conversation." The elderly woman beside him stood, gathering her belongings. She gave Marcus a knowing smile. "Take care of yourself, young man. You're stronger than you think." As she walked away, Marcus felt a surge of determination. He stood, straightening his jacket, and followed the lead attendant toward the front of the plane. Karen stood off to the side, her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She didn't say a word, but her body language spoke volumes. She was on edge, and it showed. Once they reached the galley, the lead attendant gestured toward an empty seat. "Please, have a seat," he said. Marcus obliged, his movements calm and deliberate. The attendant pulled up a chair across from him, his expression serious but not unkind. "I want to start by apologizing for any discomfort you may have experienced during this flight." The attendant began. "We strive to provide a welcoming and professional environment for all our passengers, and it seems that standard may not have been met today." Marcus met his gaze, his voice measured. "I appreciate your acknowledgement. This wasn't just about discomfort. It was about being treated differently for reasons that had nothing to do with my ticket or my behavior." The attendant nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand. And I want you to know that we take these matters very seriously. I've already spoken with several passengers who witnessed the interactions, and their accounts are consistent with yours." Karen, who had been lingering nearby, stepped forward, her voice sharp. "With all due respect, I think this is being blown out of proportion. I was simply doing my job, and if anyone felt offended, it wasn't intentional." Marcus turned to her, his expression calm but firm. Intentions matter less than actions. What I experienced wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was targeted, deliberate, and frankly unacceptable. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the lead attendant raised a hand, cutting her off. Karen, I think it's best if you refrain from commenting for now. This is a sensitive matter, and we need to handle it appropriately. Karen's face flushed, but she stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus turned his attention back to the lead attendant. I'm not looking for confrontation, he said, but I do expect accountability. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through this. The attendant nodded again, his expression thoughtful. Understood. We'll be filing a detailed report with the airline's management team, and you have my assurance that this will be thoroughly investigated. Before Marcus could respond, Peter appeared at the front of the plane, his phone in hand. Excuse me, he said, addressing the lead attendant. I think you should see this. He held up his phone, the screen displaying the video he had taken during the flight. The recording captured Karen's interactions with Marcus, her dismissive comments, and the growing tension in the cabin. The lead attendant watched intently, his expression darkening with every passing second. When the video ended, he looked at Karen, his tone firm. This is not acceptable. We'll need to address this immediately. Karen's face paled, but she didn't say a word. The weight of the evidence against her was undeniable, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that her actions had consequences. Marcus watched the exchange, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He felt vindicated, but he also knew this wasn't the end. The real challenge lay ahead, ensuring that this moment led to meaningful change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment. The suspense in the air was almost unbearable, as everyone braced for the next step in a story that was far from over. As the lead flight attendant turned back to Marcus and Peter, his face a mix of concern and determination, the atmosphere in the galley grew heavier. Karen stood stiffly in the corner, her usual confidence now replaced with an air of defensiveness. Marcus, while calm on the outside, felt the intensity of the moment brewing inside him. It was clear this wasn't just about one interaction. It was becoming something much bigger, and he was caught in the center of it. Peter lowered his phone, glancing at Marcus with a reassuring nod. This isn't just about holding her accountable, he said, his voice steady but passionate. It's about making sure no one else feels they can act this way without consequence. Before the lead attendant could respond, another flight attendant appeared, her expression urgent. Excuse me, she said softly, pulling the lead attendant aside. They exchanged hushed words, and while their conversation wasn't audible, their body language spoke volumes. The lead attendant's face grew more serious with every word, his brows furrowing deeply. When he turned back, his tone had shifted. There's another issue we need to address, he said, his gaze moving from Marcus to Karen. It seems a passenger has filed a formal complaint about your behavior, Karen. It wasn't just this incident. They claim this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Marcus' eyebrows raised slightly, his curiosity piqued. He hadn't expected the story to take this turn. Karen, on the other hand, froze. Her face turned pale, and she stammered. That's ridiculous. I've always conducted myself professionally. The lead attendant crossed his arms, his voice firm. This passenger provided specific details about a prior flight. They mentioned feeling dismissed and targeted in a way that aligns with today's events. I'll need to report this along with everything else. Karen's defensiveness turned into outright panic. You can't seriously believe them. People make things up all the time. This is just a misunderstanding, like I said earlier. Marcus watched the exchange, his mind racing. He had been focused on his own experience, but now he was beginning to realize that Karen's behavior might not be an isolated incident. The thought unsettled him. How many others had endured similar treatment but hadn't had the opportunity or courage to speak up? As the lead attendant continued to address Karen, another unexpected voice cut through the tension. It was the elderly woman who had been seated next to Marcus earlier. She had lingered near the exit, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Excuse me," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "I'd like to add something to this discussion." All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her presence instantly commanding respect. "I've been flying for decades," she began, her voice steady, "and I've seen my fair share of difficult passengers and crew members. But what I witnessed today was different. It was deliberate, targeted, and completely unacceptable." Karen's face turned red, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the woman raised a hand to stop her. "I don't care to argue," she said sharply. "I'm simply here to make sure my perspective is noted." Marcus handled himself with dignity, and Peter stood up for what was right. "But it shouldn't have come to this. Your airline needs to do better." The lead attendant nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for sharing that. We value your input, and it will be included in our report." Karen, visibly shaken, retreated further into the galley, her confidence crumbling with each passing moment. But before the conversation could continue, another surprising twist emerged. A security officer appeared at the door of the plane, his presence instantly commanding attention. He approached the lead attendant and whispered something in his ear, causing the man's expression to shift again. The lead attendant turned back to the group, his tone even more serious. "It seems this situation has caught the attention of airport security," he said. "They'd like to speak with all involved parties before anyone leaves the premises." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't anticipated this level of escalation, but he remained composed. He exchanged a glance with Peter, whose expression mirrored his own mix of surprise and resolve. Meanwhile, Karen looked like she was on the verge of breaking down completely. Her carefully constructed facade was unraveling, and it was clear she was struggling to maintain control. The passengers who had already disembarked were now gathered near the gate, their murmurs filling the air as word of the incident spread. Marcus felt their eyes on him as he stepped off the plane, flanked by Peter and the elderly woman. The security officer guided them to a private room, where the tension reached a boiling point. Inside the room, the lead attendant began to recount the events, his words careful and measured. Karen sat stiffly in a chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Marcus remained silent, letting the facts speak for themselves. But as the lead attendant detailed the second complaint against Karen, she finally snapped. "This is a setup," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "You're all against me. You've taken the word of a few passengers over someone who's dedicated years to this job." The security officer raised a hand to calm her. "Miss Karen," he said firmly, "this isn't about assumptions or conspiracies. We're gathering facts. If there's been a misunderstanding, it will come to light. But the evidence we've seen so far is concerning." Karen's outburst only seemed to solidify the growing consensus against her. Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, yes, but also a deep sadness. He had never wanted things to escalate this far, but he also knew it was necessary. What mattered now was how the situation would resolve, and whether it would lead to real accountability and change. As the conversation continued, Marcus couldn't help but feel that there was still more to uncover. The tension in the room was palpable, and the stakes had never felt higher. It was clear that the climax of this story was just around the corner, and no one, not Karen, not Marcus, not the airline, could predict how it would unfold. The tension in the room reached its peak as the security officer looked over at his notes, his expression unreadable. The lead flight attendant sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, while Marcus, Peter, and the elderly woman waited with bated breath. Karen, sitting rigidly across the table, looked more defensive than ever. Her earlier outburst had only added to the gravity of the situation, and now it seemed that the resolution was finally near. The security officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. After reviewing the video evidence, the passenger statements, and the complaint history, "We've identified a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored," he said firmly. "Miss Karen, this isn't just about today's incident. The report from the previous passenger aligns with what we've seen here, suggesting this is not an isolated case." Karen's face turned pale, and for the first time, her defiance wavered. "But I've been with this airline for years," she stammered. You can't just take their word over mine. The security officer met her gaze. It's not just their word. The evidence speaks for itself. Your actions have caused distress to multiple passengers. And that's a direct violation of the airline's code of conduct. We'll be forwarding this matter to management for further disciplinary action. Karen's shoulders slumped, and for a moment it looked as if she might try to argue again. But instead, she sat back in her chair, her expression a mix of disbelief and resignation. The room was silent except for the faint sound of papers shuffling as the officer prepared the final report. Then, just as the tension seemed to ease, a knock at the door brought everyone's attention back to the present. Another airline representative stepped in, holding a small folder. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing at the group, "but I think this might add some clarity." The officer nodded for her to proceed. She opened the folder and handed him a printed document. "We ran a quick check on Miss Karen's employee records after the second complaint came in. It appears that there were additional incidents reported in the past, but they were never escalated. The reasons are unclear, but it's possible they were dismissed or overlooked." The room fell silent again as the implications of this revelation sank in. Karen looked like she had been struck by lightning. "That's not true," she blurted out. "I've never been disciplined for anything like this before." The representative sighed. "Perhaps not formally, but there's a pattern here. The airline will be investigating why these reports didn't lead to action sooner." Marcus exchanged a glance with Peter, who raised his eyebrows in astonishment. The twist had shifted the story yet again, uncovering deeper issues within the airline itself. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about a system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The security officer stood, signaling that the meeting was drawing to a close. "We'll make sure this situation is handled appropriately," he said, his tone decisive. "Marcus, Peter, and Mom," he added, addressing the elderly woman, "thank you for your patience and for bringing this to our attention. Your voices have made a difference." As they filed out of the room, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief that the ordeal was over, gratitude for the support he received, and a lingering sense of unease about the systemic issues that had come to light. Peter patted him on the back. "You handled that like a pro," he said. "Not everyone would have had the courage to stand up like you did." The elderly woman smiled warmly. "You've paved the way for change, young man. That's no small thing." As they stepped into the terminal, Marcus noticed a small crowd of passengers gathered nearby, their faces lit with curiosity and concern. Some of them approached, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. It was a humbling moment, a reminder that even in difficult times, there were people willing to stand together for what was right. But just as Marcus thought the story was winding down, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see an email notification from the airline. Opening it, he saw a message from their corporate office, thanking him for his feedback and informing him that they'd like to invite him to join their advisory board for diversity and inclusion. He stared at the screen in surprise. It was the last thing he'd expected, but it felt like the perfect ending, or perhaps the beginning of a new chapter. He turned to Peter and the elderly woman, a smile spreading across his face. "Looks like this isn't over after all," he said. And as he walked away, the hum of the terminal around him, Marcus couldn't help but feel that justice had not only been served, but had set the stage for something greater.